I have dropped the hacks on thieves, murderers, and traitors, but on that January morning, they put a mask on my face and handed me an axe for the king. How do you raise a blade against a man who was supposed to be chosen by God? You don't think about the crown, you just look at the neck. That trick had worked for me for over a decade. Narrow the world down to one part of it your hands actually have to deal with. Let everything else fall away. That morning, for the first time, it almost didn't work. My hands were shaking before I even left the house. And somewhere in that freezing dark, walking toward a scaffold built for a death no executioner alive had ever practiced for, I understood something that has never left me since. There is no trick large enough for some mornings. You just have to walk into them anyway. My name is Richard Brandon. 50 deaths, maybe 60. I stopped counting in my 30s because the number told you nothing about the weight of any single one. My father held this post before me, Gregory Brandon, common executioner of London. I grew up in a house where this was simply the family trade. The way another boy's father worked on iron or leather, except the thing we worked on never came back the next morning. He taught me on a freezing morning at Tyburn. My hands wouldn't stop shaking that day either. He said, "The crowd is not a business. The crime is not a business. The judge already decided the crime. Your only business is the neck." I buried that lesson so deep it became instinct. A murderer's neck, a thief's neck, a traitor's neck. It made no difference to my hands. That indifference became the only thing I was actually proud of in this trade. The neck is the neck, until the morning it wasn't. A name would arrive from the court, or whisper through a clerk who knew where to find me. A date, a time. I would walk to wherever the scaffold stood, take the blade myself because I trusted no one else's judgment on an hedge that mattered this much, and wait. The crowd told you everything before the condemned even appeared. Small crowd, small crime, forgotten by supper. Large crowd, the seat you wanted to remember. I had stood before crowds of several hundred and considered that large. I had no frame of reference yet for what was coming. The knock came before dawn, late January 1649. 2 men, no names offered. The kind of stillness in their posture that told me, before they said a word, that refusing was not really one of the options on the table, only the appearance of one. I opened the door, already braced for a prize and a date. They gave me the name of the king. I made them repeat it, not because I misheard, because some part of me needed to hear it twice before I would allow myself to believe it. They told me what the criers had been shouting through the streets for weeks, a court built specifically for this purpose, one that had never existed before and was never meant to exist again. I tried Charles Stuart for treason, not against some foreign power, against his own people. He had raised armies against the parliament, and the nation was crowned to protect. 7 years of war, tens of thousands of dead Englishmen killed by other Englishmen, because the man at the top had decided his authority answered to nothing beneath God himself. The court ruled otherwise, sentenced 2 days earlier, dying on the 13th of January, whether I agreed or not. The only question was whether my hands did it cleanly, or some replacement found in a hurry turned the most consequential execution in the country's history into a horror London would whisper about for 100 years. They told me the price, £30, more than I earned most years. Then they told me about the mask. You do not hide the face of a man performing righteous, celebrated work. Soldiers who win battles get their portraits painted. Judges get their names recorded with pride. You hide the face of a man you're sending somewhere you won't fully come back from. I understood it in the time it takes to draw one breath. Whoever swung that axe would spend the rest of his life haunted by men who believed, not as metaphor, with the full certainty of religious conviction that killing God's anointed king was the worst blasphemy a person could commit. Traitors leave behind grudges sometimes, a brother, a son, a handful of names to watch for in a crowd until time wore the anger down. This would not be a handful of names, this would be half of England, for as long as half of England kept believing what it currently believed. I asked for the night to decide. They gave me until dawn, and something in how they said it told me the choice was mostly theater. Dawn was coming regardless. The only thing undecided was whether I walked toward it willingly or got dragged. I did not sleep that night, not from fear of the crowd, though that fear sat with me too. One question wouldn't leave my hands alone. How do you do this correctly? Every execution before this, I knew the geometry without thinking, the angle of a neck, the height a block needed for a given man's build, the exact distance my arm needed to travel for one clean stroke, instead of two clumsy ones that thrown a death into the kind of horror a crowd never forgets. I had never executed a king. No geometry for it, no precedent, no older man in this trade I could ask. Nobody in living memory had stood where I was about to stand, which meant whatever I did in the morning, I would be doing for the first time in front of the largest, most divided crowd London had ever assembled. I ran the motion through my mind in the dark, over and over. Underneath the rehearsal sat a colder thought that wouldn't move. If my hand shakes even slightly tomorrow, I become, in every history written from this day forward, the man who tortured the king to death out of nerves. That thought, not the money, not the danger waiting afterward, is what kept my eyes open until grey light came through the shutters. I was not afraid of killing him. I was afraid of killing him badly. I said yes before the sun fully rose. I will not pretend the reason was noble, not loyalty to the parliament. I had no particular loyalty to either side of a war that had simply happened around me for 7 years while I continued my trade, regardless of who held power. Kings die, governments change, and the neck remains the neck. That had always been my only real philosophy, not belief that it deserved death. I held no strong opinion and had no intention of forming one the morning I would need steady hands, far more than opinions, cold arithmetic, the kind that had kept me employed for over a decade. Someone was swinging that axe regardless of what I decided. If it was happening anyway, it would happen better in hands that understood the geometry rather than in some desperate replacement who would turn it into a spectacle nobody watching would ever forget. It deserved that much. The same mercy I would give any man who knelt in front of me. I sent word back before the two men had even finished their breakfast. The morning of the 13th of January, 1649, was the coldest of my career. I dressed in clothes that weren't mine, delivered the night before, plain, dark, unremarkable. I attached the first bed with fingers clumsy from the cold and from something that wasn't entirely the cold, fumbling it twice before it held. I held the mask in my hands longer than I needed to. Putting it on wasn't like hiding, it was closer to disappearing. The moment the fabric settled and the world narrowed to two small openings, which at Brandon stopped existing for the day. What walked toward the scaffold was a function, a faceless hand attached to an axe, erasing every trace of who had made it move. I had never walked toward a crowd that size in my life. Thousands of people. I had executed men before crowds of several hundred and called that substantial. This was bodies pressed against each other from the scaffold all the way back through the streets surrounding Whitehall. Breath rising off the mass of them like steam off a held animal. Somewhere behind me, a child was crying. The particular high, frightened cry of someone too young to understand what they had been brought to watch. only that the adults around them had gone very quiet. Soldiers lined the scaffold, not ceremony. The authorities genuinely feared this crowd might surge forward and stop everything by sheer weight of numbers. Some had clearly come for justice, faces hard and satisfied, men who had lost sons and brothers to the 7 years of a war. They blamed entirely on the figure who would shortly kneel in front of me. Others were already weeping, not performing for an audience. Genuine, helpless weeping, the kind that comes from people who believe they are about to witness the funeral of something larger than one life, the funeral of an entire idea about how the world was arranged. God at the top, the king just beneath God, everyone else properly beneath the king. The tension radiating off that crowd was the loudest silence I have ever stood in. I stood on the scaffold, axe against my shoulder, the way my father had taught me, and made myself do the only thing that had ever worked for me in the street. I narrowed the wall down to the neck. It almost held. The block had been built lower than any I had used before, deliberately, so the king would lie near the flat rather than kneel with his head raised in any posture of visible dignity. I stood beside it, masked, waiting, listening to the particular sound of thousands of held breaths make together, somehow silence, and the loudest thing imaginable at once. Then the soldiers brought him out, and the crowd did something I had never witnessed before. It went almost entirely silent, the silence of something too large for sound. I have watched men weep on their way to execution. I have watched men collapse before the blade even touched them. Watched grown men beg in voices that still visit me some nights, decades later. Charles Stuart walked toward that block with more composure than I had witnessed with any man I had ever executed. He wore 2 shirts beneath his outer clothing. I noticed this immediately, the way you notice small details when your mind can't process the larger event. To guard against the cold causing a shiver the crowd might mistake for fear. He stopped near the front hedge and began to speak. His voice didn't carry well. The wind took most of it, and only those closest could hear clearly, which I understood later had been deliberate. The scaffold and soldiers positioned to limit how far his words could travel, but I was close enough. I had nearly all of it. He spoke first about the war, about his belief, sincere, as far as I could judge, that he had never intended the suffering that unfolded during his reign, that he had acted in defense of the law and the church and the ancient right of the crown, not in opposition to the people he was anointed to protect. He spoke about his conscience, forgave the men who had brought him here, named no one specifically, no bitterness I could detect. He spoke about his family, briefly, his composure tightening, the only moment where something genuinely human cracked through the calm he had clearly prepared in advance. Then he said a sentence I have thorned over than any other I have heard in my life. The subject and the sovereign were different things, he said. He was dying as a martyr. He did not fear what was coming because his course belonged to God. I stood there in my mask, holding an axe meant for his neck, listening to a man explain with complete sincerity why none of this should be happening to him at all. I did not know what to do with that. I am not certain I know even now. He finished and turned to the bishop attending him. A brief, quiet exchange, words of prayer. The bishop's hands on his shoulder, the only purely tender moment in that entire freezing morning. Then he turned toward me. He could not see my eyes. He would never know my name. But he spoke to me directly, to the mask. He asked whether the block was steady, the blade sharp, whether I understood he wanted one clean stroke, nothing prolonged. I told him it would be done properly. The only conversation I have ever had with a king. And since then, I have thrown those few sentences over more than any conversation I've had with anyone I actually loved. He knelt, arranged his own hair with his own hands so it wouldn't interfere with the blade. A small practical gesture from a mind still entirely his own. He gave the signal himself. A simple motion of his hands, agreed beforehand, because even a king understood the man with the axe needed no ambiguity. I raised the axe. In that half second, 7 years of war, an entire argument about where power on earth comes from, a nation holding its breath, all of it compressed into nothing. I felt none of it, not God, not Parliament, not the 30 pounds waiting in the pocket I wouldn't feel again until this was finished, not the mask, damp now against my own held breath, only the neck, the single line my arm needed to find and follow exactly, because it deserved the same mercy I had given 50 people who deserved it far less. The axe fell, one stroke. The sound the crowd made does not have a proper name in any language I know. Not a cheer, not entirely grief. One single vast groan, thousands of throats, releasing the same sound at the same instant, as though the crowd had briefly become one body, that had just felt something essential tear loose inside it. I have been told this particular sound has never been precisely repeated at any public event in England since. I believe that. I don't think a sound like that repeats easily. Beneath it, almost immediately, the silence returned, faster than I expected, as though the crowd has used up everything it had in that single groan and had nothing left to follow it with. I held up what I was required to hold up, said the words I was required to say. Underneath the mask, my hands, steady, through the only motion that had actually mattered, began shaking so violently the moment the formal requirement ended that I nearly dropped what I was holding in front of the entire crowd. The crowd had come to witness history. I had only wanted to finish the hardest job of my career without disgracing either of us. I had managed that much. It remains the only thing from that morning I have ever felt completely certain about. I left with 30 pounds in my pocket, and the secret I understood, that even walking quickly away through streets, still buzzing with shock, would not stay secret for long. I went home, removed the mask and beard alone, in private, and became simply Richard Brandon again, a tradesman who told almost no one, not even those closest to me, exactly what those hands had done that morning. It did not protect me nearly as long as promised. Rumors moved through London within weeks. My name surfaced despite every precaution taken to prevent it. I was recognized more than once by men whose expressions told me clearly that recognition that year was not safe for either of us. I lived a little longer after that morning. Some called it natural curses. Others, even then, whispered that no man carries what I carried and continues living an ordinary life afterward. That something breaks in a man who has held the most consequential axe in his country's history, and no amount of money repairs it. I leave you to decide which version you find more believable. I did not think about kings or God or Parliament or 7 years of war in the half second that mattered most in my life. I thought about the neck. I have asked myself many times whether that makes me a monster or simply a craftsman who performed with more skill and care than anyone watching that frozen morning could have understood. The single most consequential task ever placed into any executioner's hands. I have never found an answer that satisfies me. What I know is this: England had no king at all for 11 years after that stroke. When the monarchy returned in 1660, its first instinct toward the men responsible for the old king's death was not forgiveness. It was the gallows, methodically, for every man they could find. I was already dead by then. A full 11 years gone, resting in the ground nobody came looking to disturb. I have never decided whether that timing made me fortunate. I suspect I never will. My name is Richard Brandon. I wore a mask so the world would never know my face. But on that scaffold, in the half second the rest of my life would be measured against, there was no God watching either of us, no crown, no 7 years of war compressed into the moment. There was only a blade, a neck, and a man whose entire trade had trained him without him ever fully choosing it for exactly this one task. I gave him a clean death. It is the only thing from that frozen morning, completely certain I got right.